Good morning. It's a great pleasure to open this morning session of Bob's Locke lectures between saying and doing. But before I give him his word, I still have to make some announcements. The first announcement is that I thank very much Yada Peregrine, who made that meeting of philosophers who are interested not only in Bob's work, but in philosophy altogether possible. Yarda prepared it and his staff, and I think we have to thank him very much that he did that and took the effort to do so. But we had in Pittsburgh, people who did the work on the other side of the Atlantic, Jeremy Hayes and Alp Aker, and I think we have to thank them too. They had, for example, organized the poster and sent all the invitations out. Other announcements, the following. Please, when we have the discussions later, that holds for the whole 3 days, please use the microphone because else you won't get recorded, and there is a recording going on, and it would be nice if you use the microphone when you ask questions, then it will be recorded. For following the talk of Bob Brandom, it would be very good if everybody has the handout. And for this, you just have to register downstairs if you don't have the handout yet. Please do that, not only because of the handout, but also because you need the name tag. We have here some control people who want to see your name tag, and it would be good if you have it. Yeah, of course, some people might have forgotten it at home, but it would be good to have it. The coffee break, in the coffee break, we have coffee up there on the second floor. And another announcement, this evening at 6:30, there is a party, philosopher's party in the French restaurant here right behind us, and everybody is invited. So, but once again, by the way, I hear that you need the name tag. Just okay. Yes. Yeah, of course. It doesn't cost anything to register. You are just asked to do so in order to get the things you need. So I do not intend to give any introductions to Bob and his lecture because everybody knows it already. I think we already had a very good introduction in the School of Inferentialism, and I feel that it's really great that we can have such a long time for a whole 6 days to discuss Bob's work. But the School of Inferentialism was just the preparation for what's going on for the next 3 days. And I give the word to Bob. He will talk to us this morning about the first lecture, Extending the Project of Analysis.
Well, I very much appreciate everybody being here. My aim in these lectures is to present a new way of thinking about language, and more specifically about the relations between meaning and use, or between what's said and the activity of saying it. To do that, I want to introduce a new meta-theoretic conceptual apparatus and develop it through application to a number of sort of locutions that have properly long been the focus of intense philosophical interest. Logical and semantic vocabulary, indexical vocabulary, modal, normative, and intentional vocabularies. The concerns that animate this enterprise arise from a way of thinking about the general project that's been pursued by analytic philosophy over the past century or so, and in particular about its epic confrontation with Wittgensteinian pragmatism. Justifying that rendering of the tradition would take me far afield, but it'll be well to begin with at least a sketch of that motivating picture. I think of analytic philosophy as having at its center a concern with semantic relations between what, following Rorty, I'll call vocabularies. Its characteristic form of question is whether and in what way you can make sense of the meanings expressed by one kind of locution in terms of the meanings expressed by some other kind of locution. So, for instance, two early paradigmatic projects were to show that everything expressible in the vocabulary of number theory, and again, everything expressible using definite descriptions, is expressible already in the vocabulary of first-order quantificational logic with identity. Now, the nature of the key semantic relation between vocabularies has been variously characterized during the history of analytic philosophy as analysis, definition, paraphrase, translation, reduction of different sorts, truth-making, various kinds of supervenience, just to name a few of the contenders. In each case, though, I think it's characteristic of classical analytic philosophy that logical vocabulary is accorded a privileged role in specifying those semantic relations. It's always been taken to be at least licit to appeal to logical vocabulary in elaborating the relation between analysandum and analysans, between a target vocabulary and a base vocabulary. I'm going to refer to this aspect of the analytic project as its commitment to semantic logicism. Now, if we ask which were the vocabulary kinds whose semantic relations it was thought to be important to investigate during this period, I think at least two core programs of analytic philosophy show up: empiricism and naturalism. Those were already venerable early modern philosophical traditions in epistemology and ontology, but they were transformed in the 20th century, first by being transposed into a distinctively semantic key, and second by the application of the newly available logical vocabulary to the self-consciously semantic programs that empiricism and naturalism then became. As base vocabularies, different species of empiricism appealed to phenomenal vocabulary, expressing how things appear, or to secondary quality vocabulary, or less demandingly, just to observational vocabulary. And typical target vocabularies to be understood in terms of those bases included objective vocabulary formulating claims about how things actually are, as opposed to how they merely appear, primary quality vocabulary, theoretical vocabulary, and modal, normative, semantic, and intentional vocabularies. The generic challenge is to show how what's expressed by the use of such target vocabularies can be reconstructed from what's expressed by the use of the base vocabulary, at least when it's elaborated by the use of logical vocabulary. Again, as base vocabularies, different species of naturalism appeal to the vocabulary variously of fundamental physics, or sometimes to the vocabulary of the natural sciences more generally, including the special sciences, and sometimes just to objective descriptive vocabulary, even when not regimented by incorporation into explicit scientific theories. And its typical target vocabularies included, again, normative, semantic, and intentional vocabularies. What I want to call the classic project of analysis, then, aims to exhibit the meanings expressed by various target vocabularies to show it as intelligible by means of the logical elaboration of the meanings expressed by base vocabularies, which are thought to be privileged in some important respects, whether epistemological, ontological, or semantic, relative to those target vocabularies. And this enterprise is visible in its purest form in what I've called the core programs of empiricism and naturalism in the various forms that they took. Now, in my view, the most significant conceptual development in this tradition, just the biggest thing that ever happened to it, is the pragmatist challenge to it that was mounted in the middle years of the 20th century. Generically, this movement of thought amounts to a displacement from the center of philosophical attention of the notion of meaning in favor of that of use. In suitably broad senses of those terms, replacing concern with semantics by concern with pragmatics. The towering figure behind this conceptual sea change is, of course, Wittgenstein. But in approaching it, it'll be useful to start coming at his radical and comprehensive critique by means of some more local, semantically corrosive, argumentative appeals to the practices of deploying various vocabularies rather than the meanings they express. Wilfrid Sellars, one of my particular heroes, criticizes the empiricist core program of the classical project of analysis on the basis of what one must do in order to use various vocabularies, and so to count as saying or thinking various kinds of things. He argues that none of the various candidates for empiricist base vocabularies are practically autonomous, that is, could be deployed in a language game one played, though one played no other. For instance, no discursive practice, he argues, can consist entirely of making non-inferential observation reports. For such reliably differentially elicited responses qualify as conceptually contentful or cognitively significant only insofar as they can serve as premises from which it's appropriate to draw conclusions, that is, insofar as they can serve as reasons for other judgments. And drawing such conclusions is applying concepts inferentially, that is, precisely not making non-inferential, observational, responsive use of them. Quine offers an even broader pragmatist objection, not only to the empiricist program, but to essential aspects of the whole analytic semantic project. For he attacks the very notion of meaning that it presupposes. Quine is what I've elsewhere called a methodological pragmatist. That is, he takes it that the whole point of a theory of meaning is to explain, codify, or illuminate features of the use of linguistic expressions. He, like Dummett, endorses the analogy, meaning is to use as theory is to observation. And he argues that postulating meanings associated with bits of vocabulary just yields a bad theory of discursive practice. For if there were such things as meanings that determine how it would be correct to use our expressions, those meanings would at least have to determine the inferential roles of expressions, what follows from applying them, and what applying them rules out, and what's good evidence for or against doing so. But what follows from what depends on what else is true, on laws of nature and obscure contingent facts, that is, on what claims are available to serve as auxiliary hypotheses or collateral premises in those inferences. If we look at what practical abilities are required to deploy various bits of vocabulary, that is, at what one has to be able to do in order to count as saying something with them, we do not, Quine thinks, find any special set of those whose practical significance can be understood as pragmatically distinctive of semantically necessary or sufficient conditions. Quine thought that one could save at least the naturalist program by retreating semantically to the level of reference and truth conditions. James and Dewey, though, appeal to the same sort of methodological pragmatism in support of more sweeping forms of semantic revisionism. And under the banner, "Don't look to the meaning, look to the use," Wittgenstein further radicalizes the pragmatist critique of semantics, pointing out to begin with that one cannot assume that uses of singular terms have the job of picking out objects, nor that declarative sentences are always in the business of stating facts. He goes on to deny in effect that such uses even form a privileged center on the basis of which one can understand more peripheral ones. Language, he famously says, has no downtown. Now, I take it that Wittgenstein also understands the home language game of the concept of meaning to be explanations of how expressions are correctly used. And he's profoundly skeptical about the utility or applicability of the model of postulation, explanation, and theoretical systematization in the specific case of discursive practice. That is, about the possibility of systematically deriving aspects of correct use from assigning meanings. One of his ideas, I think, is that enterprise makes sense only if we think of the uses as somehow species of one genus, of them all being the same general kind of use, say stating facts or representing states of affairs. That might seem plausible if we focus on a very restricted set of uses, just as, in the case of tools, we might be impressed initially to notice that nails and hammers, screws and screwdrivers, glue and brush all have the function of attaching more or less flat things to one another. So we could think of declarative sentences as stating variously empirical, physical, normative, modal, or intentional facts, as making claims about those different kinds of states of affairs, even if at the cost of then finding ourselves somewhat metaphysically puzzled about the nature of the fact kinds to which we've thereby committed ourselves. But if we think of the uses as very different, if we also think about the carpenter's level, his pencil, and his tool belt, if we think of linguistic practice as a motley, of uses as not coming in a simple, systematic, or even determinate variety, then the very idea that there is such a thing as meanings that permit the codification of proprieties of use, of those quite disparate kinds of use, even with the liberal use of the logical elaboration of those meanings, becomes contentious and in need of justification, both in general and in each particular case. More specifically, Wittgenstein uses the image of family resemblances to urge that the kinds in which linguistic practices and the vocabularies caught up in them are functionally sorted, what belong together in boxes with such labels as game, name, assertion, observation, and so on, do not typically admit of specification in terms of underlying principles specifiable in other vocabularies, whether by genus and differentiae or any other kind of explicit rule or definition. It's easy to understand this line of thought as entailing a straightforward denial of the possibility of semantic analysis in the classical sense. I think that one thought underlying these observations about the unsystematic, unsurveyable variety of kinds of use of expressions, and about the uncodifiable character of those kinds, concerns the essentially dynamic character of linguistic practice. I think Wittgenstein thinks that an absolutely fundamental discursive phenomenon is the way in which the abilities required to deploy one vocabulary can be practically extended, elaborated, or developed so as to constitute the ability to deploy some further vocabulary, or to deploy the old vocabulary in quite different ways. Many of his thought experiments concern this sort of process of pragmatic projection of one practice onto another. We're asked to imagine a community that uses proper names only for people, but then extends the practice to include rivers. There's no guarantee that the interlocutors can master the extended practice building on what they already can do. But if they can, they will have changed the only essence or meaning that proper name usage could be taken to have had. For instance, in the old practice, it always made sense to ask for the identity of the mother and father of the named item. In the new practice, the question is often senseless. Again, we're asked to imagine a community that talks about having gold or silver in one's teeth, and extends that practice to talk about having pain in one's teeth. If, as a matter of contingent fact, the practitioners can learn to use the expression in the new way, building on but adapting the old, they will have fundamentally changed the meaning of in. In the old practice, it made sense to ask where the gold was before it was in one's tooth. In the new practice, asking where the pain is before it was in the tooth can only lead to a distinctively philosophical kind of puzzlement. I should say that it's reading Hans Julius Schneider's book that led me to think about Wittgenstein in this way. The reason vocabulary kinds resist specification by rules or principles, definitions or meanings expressed in other vocabularies is that they're the current time slices of processes of development of practices that have this dynamic character. And that's why the collection of uses that is the current cumulative and collective result of such developments by practical projections is a motley. And again, parenthetically, Mark Wilson's recent wonderful book, Wandering Significance, gives us an account of the mechanisms and structures of that sort of projection that I think fills in an extremely illuminating way, this fundamental Wittgensteinian point. If those dynamic processes are why language is a motley, then any codification or theoretical systematization of the uses of those vocabulary kinds by associating them with meanings that determine which uses are correct will, if it's at all successful, be successful only contingently, locally, and temporarily. Semantics on this view would be an essentially Procrustean enterprise, which could proceed only by theoretically privileging some aspects of the use of vocabulary that are not at all practically privileged, and spawning philosophical puzzlement about the intelligibility of the rest. On this conception, the classical project of analysis is just a disease that rests on a fundamental, if perennial, misunderstanding. And it's one that could be removed or ameliorated only by heeding the advice to replace concern with meaning by concern with use. The recommended philosophical attitude to discursive practice would accordingly be descriptive particularism, theoretical quietism, and semantic pessimism. On this account, Wittgenstein is putting in place a picture of discursive meaningfulness or significance that's very different from that on which the classical project of analysis is predicated. In place of semantics, we're encouraged to do pragmatics, in the sense of the study of the use of expressions in virtue of which they're meaningful at all. To the formal, mathematically inspired tradition of Frege, Russell, Carnap, and Tarski, culminating in model theoretic semantics, is opposed an anthropological, natural historical, social practical inquiry, aimed both at demystifying our discursive doings and at deflating philosophers' systematic and theoretical ambitions regarding them. I think contemporary philosophers of language have tended to draw this opposition in the starkest possible terms, treating these approaches as mutually exclusive, hence as requiring that a choice be made between them, thereby marking out what seems to me a substantial sociological fault line in our discipline. Those who are moved by the pragmatist picture generally seem to accept the particularist, quietist conclusions that Wittgenstein himself seems to have drawn from it. And those committed to some version of the project of semantic analysis have felt obliged to deny the significance of pragmatics in this Wittgensteinian sense, or at least to dismiss it as irrelevant to properly semantic concerns. In fact, in the most extreme cases, the attitudes of the anti-pragmatist philosophers of language to Wittgenstein's picture seems to verge on that of the Victorian lady to Darwin's theory. She said, "One hopes that it's not true, but that if it is true, at least it not become generally known." But I don't think we're obliged to choose between these approaches. They can be seen as complementing rather than competing with one another. Semantics and pragmatics, concern with meaning and concern with use, ought to be understood as aspects of one more comprehensive picture of the discursive. Pragmatist considerations do not oblige us to focus on pragmatics to the exclusion of semantics. We can deepen our semantics by the addition of pragmatics. If we extract the consequences from the pragmatist's observations somewhat more modestly and construe the analytic project somewhat more broadly, the two will be seen not only as compatible, but as mutually illuminating. If we approach the pragmatist's observations in an analytic spirit, we can understand pragmatics as providing special resources for extending and expanding the analytic semantic project, from exclusive concern with relations among meanings to encompass also relations between meaning and use. In its most ambitious form, such an enterprise would aspire to articulate something like a logic of the relations between meaning and use. If we leave open the possibility that the use of some vocabulary may be illuminated by taking it to express meaning or content, that is, if we do not from the beginning embrace theoretical semantic nihilism, then the most important positive pragmatist insight will be one complementary to the methodological pragmatism that I already mentioned. The thought underlying the pragmatist line of thought is that what makes some bit of vocabulary mean what it does is just how it's used. What we could call semantic pragmatism is the view that the only explanation there could in the end be for how a given meaning gets associated with a vocabulary is to be found in the use of that vocabulary, the practices by which meaning is conferred, or the abilities whose exercise constitutes deploying a vocabulary with that meaning. To broaden the classical project of analysis in the light of the pragmatist's insistence on the centrality of pragmatics, we can focus on this fundamental relation between use and meaning, between practices or practical abilities and vocabularies. We must look at what it is to use locutions as expressing meanings. That is, at what one must do in order to count as saying what the vocabulary lets practitioners express. I'm going to call this relation, just to have a label, practice vocabulary sufficiency, or usually just PV sufficiency. It obtains when engaging in a particular set of practices or exercising a specific set of abilities is sufficient for someone to count as deploying a specified vocabulary. Now, of course, it matters a lot how we think about these content-conferring, vocabulary-deploying practices or abilities. The semantic pragmatists claim that use confers meaning will revert to triviality if we're allowed to talk about using the tilde to express negation, the ability to mean red by using the word red, or the capacity to refer to electrons by the word electron. And that's to say that the interest of a PV sufficiency of some set of practices or abilities for the deploying of a vocabulary is going to be quite sensitive to the vocabulary in which we specify those practices or abilities. Talk of practices or abilities has a definite sense only insofar as it's relativized to the vocabulary in which those practices or abilities are specified. And that means that besides PV sufficiency, we should consider a second basic meaning-use relation, vocabulary practice sufficiency, or just VP sufficiency, is the relation that holds between a vocabulary and a set of practices or abilities when the vocabulary is sufficient to specify those practices or abilities. VP sufficient vocabularies that specify PV sufficient practices let one say what it is one must do to count as engaging in those practices or exercising those abilities, and so to deploy a vocabulary to say something else. PV sufficiency and VP sufficiency are two basic meaning-use relations. And in terms of those basic relations, we can define a more complex relation, the relation that holds between a vocabulary V prime and a vocabulary V, when V prime is VP sufficient to specify practices or abilities P that are PV sufficient to deploy vocabulary V. This is a relation between vocabularies. It's the composition of the two basic meaning-use relations. When it obtains, I'll say that V prime is a pragmatic metavocabulary for V. It allows one to say what it is one must do in order to count as saying the things expressed by the vocabulary V. Now, we can present this relation graphically in a meaning-use diagram, and this is the first one on your handout. The conventions of this diagram are that vocabularies are shown as ovals, practices or abilities as rounded rectangles. Basic meaning-use relations are indicated by solid arrows, which are numbered and labeled as to the kind of basic meaning-use relation they are. What I'll call resultant meaning-use relations are indicated by dotted arrows, which are also numbered and labeled both as to their kind and as to the set of basic meaning-use relations from which they result. The idea is that the resultant meaning-use relation is the relation that obtains when all of the basic meaning-use relations listed on its label obtains. So this is a meaning-use diagram of being a pragmatic metavocabulary. That's the simplest species of the genus that I want to introduce and discuss in these lectures. It's a pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabularies. It's pragmatically mediated by the practices or abilities that are specified by one of the vocabularies, V prime here, which says what counts as doing that, and that vocabulary deploys or is the use of the other vocabulary, here V, what one says by doing that. The semantic relation that's established thereby between the two vocabularies is of a distinctive sort, quite different, for instance, from definability, translatability, reducibility, or supervenience. That is, it's a different kind of semantic relation between vocabularies than those that the classical project of analysis has investigated. My basic suggestion for extending the classical project of analysis so as to incorporate as essential positive elements the insights that animate the pragmatist critique of that project is that alongside the classic semantic relations between vocabularies that analytic project has traditionally appealed to, we should also consider pragmatically mediated ones, of which the relation of being a pragmatic metavocabulary is a paradigm. Now we could ask, under what circumstances would this simplest pragmatically mediated semantic relation be philosophically interesting, when considered in connection with the sorts of vocabularies that we're already philosophically interested in the project of classical analysis? Well, at least one result that could be of considerable potential significance, I think, is if it turned out that in some cases, pragmatic metavocabularies exist that differ significantly in their expressive power from the vocabularies for the deployment of which they specify sufficient practices or abilities. I'm going to call that phenomenon pragmatic expressive bootstrapping. In particular, if one vocabulary is strictly weaker in expressive power than the other, I'm going to call that strict expressive bootstrapping. Now, one example of a claim of this shape, in the case of a pragmatically mediated semantic relation, though of course he doesn't express it in the terms of the machinery that I'm in the course of introducing, is Hugh Price's pragmatic normative naturalism, which those of you who went to the School of Inferentialism have already heard something about. Hugh argues, in effect, that although normative vocabulary is not reducible to naturalistic vocabulary, it might still be possible to say in wholly naturalistic vocabulary what it is one must do in order to use normative vocabulary. If such a claim about the existence of an expressively bootstrapping naturalistic pragmatic metavocabulary for normative vocabulary could be made out, I think it would evidently be an important chapter in the development of the naturalist core program of the classical project of philosophical analysis. And it would be a paradigm of the sort of payoff that we could expect from extending that analytic project by including pragmatically mediated semantic relations. Notice that the meaning-use diagram of the pragmatically mediated semantic relation of being a pragmatic metavocabulary illustrates a distinctive kind of analysis of that relation. It exhibits that relation as the resultant, in this case by composition, of the two basic meaning-use relations of PV sufficiency and VP sufficiency. A complex meaning-use relation is analyzed as the product of operations applied to basic meaning-use relations. This is what I'll call meaning-use analysis. And that same analytic apparatus applies also to more complex pragmatically mediated semantic relations. Consider as an example one of the pragmatist criticisms that Sellers addresses to the empiricist core program of the classical analytic project. It turns on the assertion of the pragmatic dependence of one set of vocabulary deploying practices or abilities on another. Because he thinks what one is doing in saying how things merely appear is withholding a commitment to their actually being that way, and because one cannot be understood as withholding a commitment that one isn't capable of undertaking, Sellers concludes that one cannot have the ability to say or to think how things seem or appear unless one also has the ability to make claims about how things actually are. In effect, this Sellarsian pragmatist critique of the phenomenalist form of empiricism consists in the claim that practices that are PV sufficient for is-phi talk are necessary for the practices that are PV sufficient for looks-phi talk. That pragmatic dependence of practices or abilities then induces a resultant pragmatically mediated semantic relation between the vocabularies. The meaning-use diagram for this claim is number 2 in your handout. The resultant meaning-use relation at the top is a kind of complex pragmatically mediated VV necessity or semantic presupposition. In fact, although Sellers' argument for the crucial PP necessity relation of pragmatic dependence of one set of vocabulary deploying practices or abilities on another is different in this case, his argument against the observational version of empiricism, the claim that purely non-inferential observational uses do not form an autonomous discursive practice, but presuppose inferential ones, has exactly the same form. And that's meaning-use diagram number 3. Now, I'm actually not going to discuss diagrams number 4 and 5. Those of you who know some elementary category theory will appreciate they just illustrate the fact that one of the relations we're interested in this looks phi is phi case involves not just the category theoretic operation of composition, but also of retraction, which is sort of the next most complicated one. But if that means nothing to you, it doesn't matter at all. Still, this is all extremely abstract. To make it more definite, we need to fill in at least the notion of a vocabulary, of a practice or ability, and the notions of PV sufficiency and VP sufficiency. For those are the fundamental elements that articulate what I'm calling meaning-use analysis of resultant meaning-use relations. In particular, the pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies that I'm claiming we ought to acknowledge in order to continue to pursue the classical project of philosophical analysis in the light of what's right about the pragmatist critique of it. We can do that by looking to begin with at a special case in which it's possible to be unusually clear and precise about the things and relations that play these metatheoretic roles. This is the case where vocabulary takes a purely syntactic sense. Of course, the cases we eventually care about, and the ones I'll be discussing in the bulk of the lectures, involve vocabularies understood in a sense that includes their semantic significance. But besides the advantages of clarity and simplicity, we'll find that some important formal lessons carry over from the syntactic to the semantic case. Now, the restriction to vocabularies understood in a spare semantic sense leads to a correspondingly restricted notion of what it is to deploy a vocabulary and what it is to specify practices or abilities sufficient to deploy one. Suppose we're given an alphabet, just a finite set of primitive sign types, for instance, the letters of the English alphabet. The universe generated by that alphabet then consists of all the finite strings that can be formed by concatenating elements drawn from the alphabet. And a vocabulary over such an alphabet, in the syntactic sense I'm going to be talking about for a while, is then any subset of the universe of strings that that alphabet generates. So if the generating alphabet is the English alphabet, then the vocabulary might consist of all English sentences, or all possible English texts, or all and only the sentences of making it explicit. What can we say about the abilities that count as deploying a vocabulary in this spare syntactic sense? The abilities in question are the capacity to read and write the vocabulary. In this purely syntactic sense, reading it means being able practically to distinguish within the universe generated by the vocabulary strings that do from those that do not belong to the specified vocabulary. And writing it means practically being able to produce all and only the strings in the alphabetic universe that do belong to the vocabulary. So here we want to assume as primitive abilities the capacity to read and write, in this sense, the elements of the alphabet from whose universe the vocabulary is drawn. That is, we're assuming as primitive just the capacity to respond differentially to alphabetic tokens, according to which of the finite set of types they belong to, and to produce tokens of antecedently specified alphabetic types. Then, the abilities that are PV sufficient to deploy some vocabularies can be specified in particularly simple form. They're finite state automata. As an example, suppose we begin with the alphabet that has 4 characters, A, H, O, and the exclamation point. Then we can consider the laughing Santa vocabulary, which consists of strings such as ha ha ha, ho ho ho, ha ha ho ho, and so on. You'll find on your handout a graphical representation of a laughing Santa finite state automaton, which can read and write the laughing Santa vocabulary. Here, the numbered nodes represent the states of the automaton, and the alphabetically labeled arcs represent state transitions. By convention, the starting state is represented by a square, that's state 1, and the final state by a circle with a thick border, that's state 4. As a reader of the laughing Santa vocabulary, the task of this automaton is to process a finite string and determine whether or not it's a licit string of the vocabulary. It processes the string one alphabetic character at a time, beginning in state 1. It recognizes the string if and only if, when and only when, it arrives at its final state, state 4. So, if the first character of the string is not an H, it remains stuck in state 1 and rejects the string. If the first character is an H, it moves to state 2 and processes the next character. If that character is not an A or an O, it remains stuck in state 2 and rejects the string. If it is an A or an O, it moves to state 3. If the next character is an exclamation point, it moves to state 4 and recognizes the string ha or ho, the shortest ones in the Laughing Santa vocabulary. If instead the next character is an H, it goes back to state 2 and repeats itself in loops of ha's and ho's any number of times till an exclamation point is finally reached or it's fed a discordant character. As a writer of the Laughing Santa vocabulary, the task of the automaton is to produce only licit strings of that vocabulary by a process that can produce any and all such strings. It begins in its initial state, state 1, and emits an H, its only available move, changing to state 2. In this state, it can produce either an A or an O, it picks one at random, and goes into state 3. In this state, it can either tack on an exclamation point and move into its final state, finishing the process, or emit another H and return to state 2 and repeat the process. In any case, whenever it reaches state 4 and halts, the string it has constructed will be a member of the Laughing Santa vocabulary. I hope this brief rehearsal makes it clear how that constellation of nodes and arrows that makes up the directed graph represents the abilities to read and write, that is, to recognize and produce arbitrary strings of the Laughing Santa vocabulary. That is, what it represents is abilities that are PV sufficient to deploy that vocabulary. That is, to read it and write it in the attenuated sense that's appropriate to this purely syntactic case. And the digraph representation is itself a vocabulary that is VP sufficient to specify those vocabulary deploying abilities. That is, the digraph representation of this finite state automaton is a pragmatic metavocabulary for the Laughing Santa vocabulary. The relation between the digraph vocabulary and the Laughing Santa vocabulary is then a pragmatically mediated one, not a semantic one, but a pragmatically mediated syntactic relation between vocabularies. I mean, it may seem that I'm stretching things to call the digraph form of representation a vocabulary. So it'll be useful, by way of representing my final point in the vicinity, to consider a different form of the pragmatic metavocabulary for the Laughing Santa vocabulary. Besides the digraph representation of a finite state automaton, we can also use a state table representation, and you'll find that on your handout, showing rows and columns. I think it's pretty easy to see how that encodes the same information that the digraph one does. Clearly, there's a tabular representation corresponding to any digraph representation of a finite state automaton, and vice versa. And notice further that we needn't use a two-dimensional table to convey that information. We could put the rows one after another, and you'll find this string also on the handout. That's just a string drawn from the universe generated by the alphabet of the Laughing Santa automaton, together with halt and designations of the states of the automaton. The strings that specify finite state automata that deploy vocabularies defined over the same basic alphabet as the Laughing Santa automaton then form a vocabulary in the technical syntactic sense we've been considering. And that means we can ask about the automata that can read and write those state table encoding vocabularies. The meaning use diagram for this is then number 6 on your handout. Restricting ourselves to a purely syntactic notion of vocabulary yields a clear sense of pragmatic metavocabulary. Both the digraph and the state table vocabularies are VP sufficient to specify practical abilities articulated as finite state automata that's PV sufficient to deploy, in the sense of recognizing and producing, the Laughing Santa vocabulary, as well as many others. Perhaps surprisingly, it also offers a prime example of strict pragmatic expressive bootstrapping. For in this setting, we can prove that one vocabulary that's expressively weaker than another can nonetheless serve as an adequate pragmatic metavocabulary for that stronger vocabulary. That is, even though one cannot say in the weaker vocabulary everything that can be said in the stronger one still can say in the weaker vocabulary everything that one needs to be able to do in order to deploy the stronger one. Here, the relevant notion of relative expressive power of vocabularies is also a purely syntactic one. Already in the 1950s, Chomsky had offered mathematical characterizations of the different set of strings of characters that could be generated by different classes of grammars, that is, in my terms, characterized by different kinds of syntactic metavocabularies, and computed by different kinds of automata. The kinds of vocabulary, grammar, and automata line up with one another and can be arranged in a strict expressive hierarchy, what's come to be called the Chomsky hierarchy. And it's summarized in the table on your handout that lines up vocabularies, grammars, and automata. The point I want to make, fortunately, doesn't require us to delve very deeply into the information that's summarized on this table. A few basic points will suffice. The first thing to realize is that not all vocabularies, in the syntactic sense I've been talking about, can be read and written by finite state automata. For instance, it can be shown that no finite state automaton is PV sufficient to deploy the vocabulary A to the n, B to the n, defined over the alphabet AB, which consists of all strings of any arbitrary number of A's followed by the same number of B's. The idea behind the proof is that in order to tell whether the right number of B's follows the A's when you're reading, or to produce the right number of B's when writing, the automaton must somehow keep track of how many A's have been processed, whether read or written. And the only way a finite state automaton can store information is by being in one state rather than another. So it could be in one state or in one of a class of states if one A has been processed and another if two have, and so on. But by definition, a finite state automaton only has a finite number of states, and that number is fixed in advance of receiving its input or producing its output. So whatever that number of states is for any given automaton, and whatever system it uses to code numbers into states, there's going to be some number of A's that's so large that the automaton runs out of states before it finishes counting. But the vocabulary in question consists of arbitrarily long strings of A's matched with B's. In fact, it's possible to say exactly which vocabularies finite state automata, the ones specifiable by digraphs and state tables of the sort we saw a minute ago, are capable of deploying. These are called regular vocabularies. And the next point is that slightly more complex automata are capable of deploying vocabularies, such as A to the n, B to the n, that are not regular and hence cannot be read or written by finite state automata. As my brief discussion indicated, intuitively the problem finite state automata have with languages like A to the n, B to the n is that they lack memory. If we give them a memory, we get a new class of machines, push-down automata. In addition to being able to respond differentially to and produce tokenings of alphabetic types and being able to change state, which is what finite state automata can do, PDAs, push-down automata, can push alphabetic values to the top of a memory stack and pull such values from the top of that stack. PDAs can do everything that finite state automata can do, but they can also read and write many vocabularies, such as A to the n, B to the n, that are not regular and so cannot be read and written by finite state automata. The vocabularies they can deploy are called context-free. All regular vocabularies are context-free, but not vice versa. This proper containment of classes of vocabularies provides a clear sense, suitable to this syntactic setting, in which one vocabulary can be thought of as expressively more powerful than another. The different kinds of grammar can specify, and the different kinds of automata can compute ever larger classes of vocabulary. Context-free vocabularies that are not regular require more powerful grammars to specify them, as well as more powerful automata to deploy them. Finite state automata are special kinds of push-down automata, and all automata are special kinds of Turing machines. Recursively enumerable vocabularies are not in general syntactically reducible to context-sensitive, context-free, or regular ones. And the less capable automata cannot read and write all the vocabularies that can be read and written by Turing machines. Nonetheless, if we look at pragmatically mediated relations between these syntactically related vocabularies, we find that they make possible a kind of strict expressive bootstrapping that permits us, in a certain sense, to evade the restrictions on expressive power that are enforced for purely syntactic relations between vocabularies. The hierarchy dictates that only the abilities codified in Turing machines, which are just two-stack pushdown automata, only the abilities codified in Turing machines are PV sufficient to deploy recursively enumerable vocabularies in general. But now we can ask a different question. What class of languages is VP sufficient to specify Turing machines, and hence to serve as sufficient pragmatic metavocabularies for recursively enumerable vocabularies in general? The surprising fact is that the abilities codified in Turing machines, the abilities to recognize and produce arbitrary recursively enumerable vocabularies, can quite generally be specified in context-free vocabularies. That is, it's demonstrable. We can prove that context-free languages are strictly weaker in syntactic expressive resources than recursively enumerable languages. The pushdown automata that can read and write only context-free languages cannot read and write recursively enumerable languages in general. But it is possible to say, entirely in a context-free language, what one needs to be able to do in order to deploy recursively enumerable languages in general. The proof of this claim is tedious, but it's not difficult. This is hardly an original result to me. Indeed, the introductory computational linguistics text that I consult actually leaves this as an exercise to its undergraduate reader to prove this, this result. Meaning use diagram number 7 on your handout characterizes this pragmatically mediated relation between the syntactically characterized vocabularies. The pushdown automata are PV sufficient to deploy context-free languages, which are VP sufficient to specify Turing machines and their programs, which are PV sufficient to deploy recursively enumerable languages in general, and that induces a new pragmatically mediated relation between context-free vocabularies and recursively enumerable vocabularies. Now, let me recall what motivated this rehearsal of some elements of automaton theory and introductory computational linguistics. I suggested that a way to extend the classical project of semantic analysis so as to take account of the insights of its pragmatist critics is to look analytically at the relations between meaning and use. More specifically, I suggested focusing to begin with on two, in some sense, complementary relations. The one that holds when some set of practices or abilities is PV sufficient to deploy a given vocabulary, and the one that holds when some vocabulary is VP sufficient to specify a given set of practices or abilities. The composition of these is the simplest pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabularies, the relation that holds when one vocabulary is a sufficient pragmatic metavocabulary for another. That's the simplest but the paradigm instance of an infinite, recursively generable class of complex, pragmatically mediated semantic relations that I propose to lay alongside the other semantic relations between vocabularies that have been investigated by analytic philosophers. For instance, those who address the core programs of empiricism and naturalism, relations between vocabularies such as analyzability, definition, translation, reduction, truth-making, and supervenience. And I suggested further that pragmatic metavocabularies might be of particular interest in case they exhibited what I called expressive bootstrapping, cases, that is, in which the expressive power of the pragmatic metavocabulary differs markedly from that of the target vocabulary, most strikingly when the metavocabulary is substantially expressively weaker. That's a phenomenon we're going to find is very common among pragmatic metavocabularies, and it's a phenomenon that Tarski has led us not to expect if we look at purely semantic metavocabularies, which typically have to be expressively substantially stronger than the language for which they are metavocabularies. Now, we've now seen that all of these notions can be illustrated with particular clarity for the special case of purely syntactically characterized vocabularies. The abilities that are PV sufficient to deploy those vocabularies, in the sense of the capacity to recognize and produce them, can be thought of as various kinds of automata. There's several well-established different but equivalent vocabularies that are known to be, in turn, VP sufficient to specify those automata. And in this special syntactic case, we can accordingly investigate the properties of pragmatic metavocabularies. And when we do, we find a striking instance of strict expressive bootstrapping in a pragmatically mediated syntactic relation between vocabularies. Of course, as I allowed at the outset, the cases we really care about involve semantically significant vocabularies. Are there any interesting instances of these phenomena in those cases? Well, I at least waved my hands at how some of Sellers's pragmatist criticisms of various ways of pursuing the empiricist program can be understood to turn on pragmatically mediated semantic relations. And I mentioned Hugh Price's idea that although normative vocabulary is not semantically reducible to naturalistic vocabulary, naturalistic vocabulary might suffice to specify what one must do, the practices or abilities one must engage in or exercise in order to deploy normative vocabulary. Here's another example that I want to point to, though I can't develop the claim here. For roughly the first 3/4 of the 20th century, philosophers who thought about indexical vocabulary took for granted some version of the doctrine that a tokening n of an expression of the type now was synonymous with, definable, or otherwise semantically analyzable as the time of utterance of n, and similarly for here and the place of utterance of h, and so on. During the 70s, philosophies such as John Perry, David Lewis, and G.E.M. Anscombe, by focusing on the use of indexicals in modal and epistemic contexts, showed decisively that this cannot be right. What's expressed by indexical vocabulary cannot be expressed equivalently by non-indexical vocabulary. This is what Perry talked about under the heading of the essential indexical. This fact seems so obvious to us now that we might well be led to wonder what philosophers such as Russell, Carnap, and Reichenbach could have been thinking about for all those years. I want to suggest that the genuine phenomenon in the vicinity is a pragmatically mediated semantic relation between these vocabularies. Specifically, in spite of the demonstrable semantic irreducibility of indexical to non-indexical vocabulary, we can show that you can't intersubstitute them in modal and epistemic contexts. In spite of the semantic irreducibility of indexical to non-indexical vocabularies, it is still possible to say entirely in non-indexical terms what one must do in order to be deploying indexical vocabulary correctly, to be saying essentially and irreducibly indexical things. For we can formulate practical rules such as, if at time t and place xyz, speaker S wants to assert that some property P holds of xyz, t, and S, it's correct to say P holds of me here and now. And if a speaker at time t and place xyz asserts P holds of me here and now, the speaker is committed to, or the claim would be true at, the property holding at xyz, t, and s. That is, I claim, non-indexical vocabulary can serve as an adequate pragmatic metavocabulary for indexical vocabulary. The fact that one nevertheless cannot say in non-indexical terms everything that one can say with indexical vocabulary just shows that these vocabularies do have different expressive powers. So the pragmatically mediated semantic relation between them is a case of strict pragmatic expressive bootstrapping. Now, I don't suppose that there actually are any indexical skeptics, people who say, I understand non-indexical vocabulary, but not indexical vocabulary. Either show me how to reduce the one to the other or show me how to do without this. But imagine if there were such a skeptic, and we demonstrate first the irreducibility of the one to the other. Well, all right, we're not going to get the reduction. Does that mean he has to do without indexical vocabulary? Well, it seems to me he can't claim to be mystified by what's expressed by indexical vocabulary if, in his favored vocabulary, we can teach him how to use the indexical vocabulary and so say irreducibly, essentially indexical things. That's the idea that Hugh Price is running with thinking of, in my terminology, the possibility of a naturalistic pragmatic metavocabulary for normative vocabulary. And we'll see that for some instances where there really are real live skeptics about what's expressed by some irreducible vocabularies, the move to look at pragmatic metavocabularies makes a huge difference to the dialectical situation. In the lectures to come, I'm going to be doing three things. I'm going to be further developing the conceptual apparatus of meaning-use analysis, both by introducing new basic meaning-use relations, but mostly by looking at new combinations, new things you can build out of just the ones we've already got. I'll be applying that apparatus to vocabularies of ongoing philosophical interest, to logical vocabulary, to modal vocabulary, to normative vocabulary, and to intentional vocabulary. If you peek ahead, the title of the final lecture is Intentionality is a Pragmatically Mediated Semantic Relation. And third, I'm going to be seeing what new pragmatically mediated semantic relations become visible when you apply this apparatus. Each subsequent lecture is going to report some unexpected and suggestive results, which I claim fit together cumulatively to constitute a distinctive novel picture of what we would have thought previously was quite familiar terrain. Besides pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies, there's another kind of pragmatic analysis which relates one constellation of practices or abilities to another. It corresponds to another basic kind of meaning-use relation, the kind of PP sufficiency that holds when having acquired one set of abilities means one can already do everything one needs to do, in principle, to be able to do something else. One concrete way of filling in a definite sense of in principle, is by algorithmic elaboration, where exercising the target ability is just exercising the right basic abilities in the right order and under the right circumstances. So in this sense, the ability to do long division just consists in the ability to do multiplication and subtraction and write down the results of those calculations according to a particular conditional branch schedule algorithm. The practical abilities that implement such an algorithmic PP sufficiency relation are just those exercised by a finite state automaton. Indeed, automata are defined by a definite set of early syntactic automata that I've described so far. And one way to do that is to replace their specialized capacities to read and write symbols, in the minimal sense of classifying tokens as to types and producing tokens of specified types, by more general recognitional and productive capacities. These are abilities to respond differentially to various non-symbolic stimuli, for instance, the visible presence of red things, corresponding generalizing the notion of reading, and to respond by producing performances of various non-symbolic kinds, for instance, walking north for a mile, corresponding to writing. What practically implements the algorithmic elaboration of such a set of basic differential responsive abilities is going to be a finite state transducing automaton. In my third lecture, tomorrow morning, I'm going to argue that this notion of algorithmic decomposability of some practices or abilities into others, the results suggests in turn a pragmatic generalization of the classical program of artificial intelligence functionalism, which, though a latecomer in the 20th century, deserves, I think, to count as a third core program of classical semantic analysis. AI functionalism traditionally held itself hostage to a commitment to the purely symbolic character of intelligence, in the sense of sapience. But broadening our concern from automata as purely syntactic engines to the realm of transducing automata will put us in a position to see AI functionalism as properly concerned with the algorithmic decomposability of discursive practices and abilities, that is, vocabulary deploying practices and abilities. What I'm going to call the pragmatic thesis of artificial intelligence is the claim that the ability to engage in some autonomous discursive practice, a language game one could play though one played no other, can be algorithmically decomposed, in principle, into non-discursive abilities. The arguments for and against this pragmatic version of AI functionalism look quite different from those arrayed on the opposing sides of the debate about the prospects for symbolic AI. And the notion of PP sufficiency is going to bring into view a slightly more complicated, pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabularies. That which obtains when the practices PV sufficient for V1 are PP sufficient, in the sense that they can be algorithmically elaborated into, practices PV sufficient for V2. Another basic meaning-use relation of the kind we've been considering is then PV necessity, the converse of PV sufficiency. It obtains when one cannot deploy a certain vocabulary without engaging in the specified practice or exercising the specified ability. For example, I've argued elsewhere that nothing could count as engaging in an autonomous discursive practice that did not include asserting and inferring. Considering that basic meaning-use relation permits the formation of a complex resultant meaning-use relation that's a variant on the prior one, a relation that obtains where the practices PV necessary for V1 are PP sufficient for practices or abilities PV sufficient for some other vocabulary V2. As it happens, it can happen, I will argue, that such a V2 can also be VP sufficient to specify the practices or abilities that are PV sufficient to deploy the original vocabulary. This is the final MUD on this, the final meaning use diagram on this part of your handout, LX. In my next lecture this afternoon, I'll introduce a version of this complex resultant pragmatically mediated semantic relation, what I call for short being universally LX, being elaborated from and explicative of practices PV sufficient for another vocabulary. And I'm going to argue that this is the genus of which logical vocabulary is a species. More specifically, I'm going to argue that logical vocabulary can both be algorithmically elaborated from and is explicative of practices that are PV necessary for the autonomous deployment of any vocabulary at all. And I'm going to argue that the most illuminating way to explain and justify the distinctive privileged role accorded to logical vocabulary by the classical project of philosophical analysis, what I've called semantic logicism, is by appeal to this whole constellation of basic meaning-use relations and the complex pragmatically mediated semantic relation that results from it. My last three lectures are going to address modal vocabulary, normative vocabulary, and the pragmatically mediated semantic relations they stand in to ordinary objective empirical and naturalistic vocabularies and to each other. The modal revolution in the last third of the 20th century breathed new life into semantic logicism, providing powerful new expressive tools, which have been of great use to those pursuing, for instance, naturalistic programs in semantics. But this successor version raises just the same questions of vindication that I'll be considering for semantic logicism in my second lecture. What justifies according modal concepts this special privileged role in our semantic analytic enterprise? This question is particularly urgent since the empiricist program had always been, traditionally with Hume and in the 20th century logical form with Quine, particularly and specifically hostile to and critical of this vocabulary. I'll begin my treatment of modality in the fourth lecture with a consideration of this question, and with a vindication of the role of modal vocabulary that parallels the one I will already have offered for ordinary logical vocabulary. That is, modal vocabulary too can be elaborated from and is explicative of features integral to every autonomous discursive practice, features intimately related to but distinct from those made explicit by ordinary logical vocabulary. I'll then enter into an extended treatment of the relation between alethic and deontic, that is, between modal and normative vocabularies. When we look at those vocabularies through the lens of meaning-use analysis, a sequence of startling relations emerges. For a start, I'll argue that deontic normative vocabulary is also universally LX. That is, that it's VP sufficient to specify practices or abilities that are both PV necessary for deploying any autonomous vocabulary and PP sufficient for practices or abilities PV sufficient for deploying the deontic normative vocabulary that explicates them. Although in this regard it belongs in a box with alethic modal vocabulary, the features of autonomous vocabulary use that normative vocabulary explicates are quite different from those explicated by modal vocabulary. I'll then argue that what lies behind Seller's dark and pregnant claim that the language of modality is a transposed language of norms is the fact that deontic normative vocabulary can serve as a pragmatic metavocabulary for alethic modal vocabulary. And in my fifth lecture, I'll show how exploiting that relation makes possible a new kind of directly modal formal semantics, one that makes no appeal at any point to a notion of truth, incompatibility semantics. It, in turn, gives us a new semantic perspective both on traditional logical vocabulary and on modal vocabulary. The final lecture will then weave all these strands into a meaning-use analysis of intentionality itself, what's expressed by intentional vocabulary, as a pragmatically mediated semantic relation, essentially involving both what's expressed by modal and what's expressed by normative vocabulary. The substantive cumulative result of this sequence of revelations about modal and normative vocabulary is to put new flesh on the bones of ideas that originate with Kant and are developed by his tradition up through the traditional American pragmatists and are reinterpreted by Sellers in the middle years of the 20th century. And the methodological result of this development and application of meaning-use analysis is a new synthesis of pragmatism and analytic philosophy, one that shows how concerns and considerations at the heart of the pragmatist critique of semantic analysis can be seen to have been implicitly at work within the analytic tradition all along. This is what I'll call analytic pragmatism. The title of this lecture series is Between Saying and Doing, and it evidently refers to my aspiration to present new ways of thinking about the relations between meaning and use that arise when we think systematically about saying what we're doing when we're saying something. But the phrase itself is taken from an Italian proverb: between saying and doing, many a pair of shoes is worn out. Following the argumentative and constructive path that I'm proposing for exploring the intricate and revealing ways in which semantics and pragmatics interdigitate will require wearing out quite a few shoes. Thank you.
Okay, in this first lecture, Bob gets his project underway, partly by putting it in a context in the history of analytic philosophy. His avowed aim is to breathe new life into a kind of philosophical activity that took shape in analytic philosophy as the classical project of analysis. He didn't exactly put it that way, breathe new life, that's mine, but I think it's fair. In its classical form, as Bob sees things, analytic philosophy aimed to cast light on semantic relations between vocabularies. The exemplary activity of analytic philosophers, on Bob's account, was directed towards showing how we can make sense of vocabularies thought to be in some way problematic, in terms of vocabularies thought not to be problematic in that way, and that's obviously leaves room for a whole lot of specifications of ways in which vocabularies can be and not be problematic. In putting things like that, Bob's aiming at a formulation with maximal generality, a formulation that fits a wide range of different ways of doing philosophy. The idea of making sense of one vocabulary in terms of another is meant to cover a great range of semantic relations, or supposed semantic relations, because some of them are targets of skepticism, between vocabularies, all the way from synonymy to just having the same subject matter. The one constant in the philosophical programs that Bob means his description to cover is that they all give logic a privileged position in specifying the semantic relations between vocabularies. That's what Bob calls semantic logicism. So in the kind of analytic philosophical activity that he has in mind, we were supposed to reassure ourselves about some vocabulary that we were finding problematic, and we were supposed to do that by engaging in logical elaboration from from some vocabulary that we were already comfortable with to the vocabulary that we were finding problematic. Now, in Bob's historical narrative, this classical analytic tradition comes under challenge from a methodological pragmatism. a way of thinking that aims to displace the notion of meaning from the center of philosophical attention in favor of the notion of use, the notion of what people do with language. At its most extreme, the thrust of the pragmatist challenge, as Bob reads it, is that this whole project of theorizing about semantic relations between vocabularies should be scrapped. But what Bob aims to do is to disarm the pragmatist challenge. Here's a formulation of a fundamental pragmatist insight. Expressions have their significance only in a practice of using them in certain ways. And what Bob proposes to do is to co-opt that insight in the service of a transformed version of the project of analysis. Suppose we have a systematic interest in the semantics of a vocabulary. That pragmatist insight requires us to pursue our systematic interest in the context of the question, what practice one must engage in to count as using the vocabulary with the significance that it has. Answering that question in a particular case would be affirming a practice-vocabulary relation, a relation between a practice and a vocabulary. And Bob calls this kind of relation practice-vocabulary sufficiency, PV sufficiency. Kind of incidental comment, that might raise some eyebrows, given that he introduces this relation by speaking of, I quote now, what one must do in order to count as saying what the vocabulary lets practitioners express. That suggests an answer to the question, what practice is necessary, rather than what practice is sufficient for a vocabulary to have its semantic character. But in this context, a condition identified as necessary, as one actually is by Bob's formulation, is a sufficient condition. If one uses a vocabulary as one must for it to have a certain significance, well, then it has that significance. And Bob needs sufficient conditions for what he goes on to do with this idea. So, practice vocabulary sufficiency, relating a practice to a vocabulary by the practice being such that engaging in it is sufficient for the vocabulary to have the significance that it has. Besides that relation, we can also consider what vocabulary suffices for specifying a practice. I mean, any practice, but it could be a practice that's PV sufficient for another vocabulary. Answering this second question, what vocabulary suffices for specifying a practice in a particular case, gives us a vocabulary practice relation, a case of VP sufficiency. And now we can combine relations of these two kinds, VP sufficiency and PV sufficiency, into a vocabulary relation. The relation that holds between two vocabularies when the first enables one to specify a practice that suffices for the second to have the significance it has. When this resultant vocabulary relation holds, the first vocabulary is, in Bob's terms, a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for the second. This resultant relation between vocabularies, a VV sufficiency relation, is the first and simplest example of the kind of relation that Bob wants to draw attention to, using his wording, pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies. So it and its kin, and it helps to focus on it to get the picture, it and its kin are resources for his new version of the project of analysis. We can still say the project of analysis aims to display semantic relations between vocabularies. But we now have a new kind of semantic relation at our disposal for doing that thing. The very idea of semantic relations of this new kind incorporates the thought that drives the pragmatist challenge, the thought that vocabularies have their semantic character only as used. Surely, Bob in effect suggests, that disarms the challenge. So these semantic relations, pragmatically mediated semantic relations, can figure in a version of the project of analysis that doesn't conflict with the fundamental pragmatist insight. That was all I paraphrase a restatement of what Bob suggests about the ancestry and the philosophical tradition of the project that he's engaged in these lectures. Now, I yield to no one in my admiration for the creativity, the resourcefulness, the pizzazz with which Bob elaborates this vision of a pragmatically inflected descendant of the classical project of analysis. But I do want to express a skepticism about whether breathing new life into the classical project ought to seem a good idea. I might say, incidentally, this is a question that I hope people will bear in mind in the later lectures. I'm not sure to what extent this framing of the project is necessary for what he's going to go on to do in these lectures. By framing his proposal in what are in effect these terms, a new version of the classical project of analysis, Bob risks making his new creature look like a sort of Frankenstein monster. I mean, something enabled to stumble about in a semblance of life by having had new organs grafted into it, organs donated by pragmatism. Grafted, that is, into something that would otherwise have been a corpse and ought to have been allowed to stay that way. Decent respect for the dead. So let me elaborate that a bit. Bob's exemplary instances of the classical project of analysis are what he identifies as two core programs in it, empiricism and naturalism. These programs reflect two different selections, or perhaps we should say, since each of them comes in multiple versions, two different styles of selection of supposedly unproblematic vocabulary. In the interest of a thought to this effect, philosophy needs to vindicate the semantic innocence of all other vocabulary by displaying it as standing in suitable semantic relations to some selected base vocabulary, or, I guess, failing that, to consign all documents containing the non-base vocabulary to the flames. Versions of empiricism, in the relevant sense, work with base vocabularies that are supposed to be unproblematic by virtue of their capacity to do something like capturing the immediate deliverances of experience on some conception or other of what it might be to do that. Versions of naturalism work with base vocabularies that are supposed to be unproblematic by virtue of something like their capacity to figure in giving expression to thoughts that are at least candidates for being validated by the natural sciences. Now, empiricism is dead, at least in the guise of a program for reassuring us about vocabularies that we were finding problematic by displaying their semantic relations to a vocabulary that's supposedly unproblematic because it captures the immediate deliverances of experience. Sellers has put paid to any empiricism of that kind, not necessarily single-handedly, but I'll focus on Sellers. Such a program could seem a starter only if one thought the base vocabulary could be viable on its own, not needing to be part of a wider vocabulary that includes the vocabulary one's supposed to explain by way of logical elaboration from the base vocabulary. If we can make sense of the base vocabulary only by seeing it as part of a vocabulary that already includes the target vocabulary, there's no go in the idea that the intelligibility of the base vocabulary fits it to cast light by logical elaboration on the target vocabulary. And that's just how things are, according to Sellers, with any candidate for the role of base vocabulary for the empiricist program. Sellers argues, I'm not dissenting from Bob at all in saying, right, but Sellers argues that there couldn't be a linguistic practice whose only moves are reports of immediate observation. And reports of immediate observation, that idea stands in there for forms of words involving the supposed base vocabulary. Understanding the language that figures in observation reports, Sellers argues, presupposes a capacity to give expression to knowledge that can't be seen as an immediate deliverance of experience. If that's right, it must be wrong to think we can be entitled to take in our stride a base vocabulary for the empiricist program while still needing to be reassured about other vocabularies. The empiricist program responds to a supposed philosophical predicament in which we understand an empiricist base vocabulary, but we don't yet understand any other vocabulary. And there's no way to make sense of that supposed predicament. Well, Bob cited Sellers as one of his heroes, and of course Bob acknowledges that Salesian thesis, the one I've just rehearsed. I can't at this point resist an incidental kvetch at Bob's reading of Sellers. It's incidental to what I want to do here, but can't resist, so I'll do it. I think Bob misrepresents Sellers' argument for this thesis that there couldn't be a standalone practice of making observation reports. The argument that Sellers gives for that thesis in the classic paper, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. As Bob reads him, he said this in today's lecture, Sellers argues that the forms of words used in observation reports count as having conceptual content only insofar as, apart from being usable in non-inferential claims, which are what reports of observation are, they can also figure as premises for inferences. Of course, it's going to follow from that that besides the non-inferential claims that are made in observational reports, there must also be inferential claims, the claims that involve claiming the conclusions of these inferences. But that's not how Sellers argues. What Sellers argues is this: the knowledge expressed in an observation report can't be conceived as acquired all by itself, atomistically, in the observation that the report reports. On the contrary, any bit of observational knowledge presupposes other knowledge, including knowledge of a sort that couldn't be expressed in observation reports. What Bob's doing in the bit of the lecture that I'm kvetching about is reading into Sellers his own overestimation of the power of the concept of inference to do philosophical work. And the result is that he obscures an epistemological dimension of Sellers' thought. Sellers' concern with observation reports isn't with what it takes for them to be conceptually contentful, it's with what it takes for them to have the kind of epistemic authority they have. For my present purposes, I can leave this complaint on one side. Bob is right that Sellers undermines the idea of a standalone practice of making observation reports. And the question how Sellers does that isn't important here. Now, Bob mentions this strand in Sellers in the context in which he's considering locally corrosive pragmatist challenges to the project of analysis, working up to the putatively devastating non-local challenge. And it's true that Sellers' thesis demolishes only the empiricist core program. Sellers' thesis doesn't address the naturalist core program, or indeed any other analytic activity. In that sense, Sellers' challenge is indeed local. But it's still true that the empiricist core program is, along with the naturalist core program, central to the way Bob introduces the very idea of the project of analysis. And by Bob's own lights, a project that's partly defined in terms of the empiricist core program doesn't look like a promising candidate to have new life breathed into it. What about the naturalist core program? In that case, we can't name someone who's killed it, as Sellers has killed the empiricist core program. Versions of the naturalist core program are still actively pursued in contemporary philosophy. But come to think of it, that much is true of the empiricist program too. In that case, the empiricist program, as in this one, the naturalist program, the sheer fact that there are people who think philosophers should engage in a certain activity doesn't by itself establish that philosophers should engage in that activity. And of course, Bob wouldn't dream of suggesting that it does. He's learned enough from his master, Richard Rorty, to completely distance himself from that kind of thought. If we're invited to join in a certain philosophical activity of this shape, core program of classical project of analysis, we need to postpone acquiescing, saying, yes, good project, until we've looked critically at the supposed grounds for the privileging of a vocabulary that defines the activity. The supposed grounds for regarding the selected vocabulary as unproblematic in some way in which other vocabularies are supposedly problematic. If the grounds don't pass muster, we should decline the invitation to engage in this practice. And Bob doesn't think we should accept the privileging that characterizes the naturalist program. In this lecture, he mentions Hugh Price's proposal for a naturalistic treatment of normative vocabulary, but only as an illustration for the idea of bootstrapping. And he refrains, I think, carefully from endorsing it himself. So, by Bob's own lights, neither of the two core programs, in terms of which he introduces the very idea of the project of analysis, is a promising candidate to be something that might, in a new shape, figure in a reinvigorated form of the project, exploiting not just the old inventory of semantic relations between vocabularies, but also Bob's new kind, pragmatically mediated semantic relations. Now, in a way, it's just beside the point for me to harp on that fact. After all, the two core programs that Bob exploits in his introduction of the project of analysis are only examples. And it's reasonable to say they're local to the classical version of the project. It would be a complete misunderstanding to think Bob is urging us to engage in pragmatically inflected descendants of those core programs. Still, the project of analysis that he's recommending is like the core programs of the classical project in privileging one vocabulary over others. When one opposes those core programs, one's opposing claims of privileged status for one vocabulary as against others. And suspicion of claims with that shape can be general. A thought that's central to pragmatism in the guise in which Richard Rorty has embraced it can be put like this. When there are several vocabularies, all with some currency, it's a mistake for philosophers to think they should be in the business of discriminating among them, selecting one to be the basis on which all the rest are to be made intelligible. If that's a mistake in general, why should we suppose it's any less a mistake if the selected vocabulary is language for describing linguistic practices than if the selected vocabulary is language for stating the deliverances of experience or language for giving expression to bits of a naturalistic worldview? There's an obvious answer to that, and I'll come to it in a minute, but one more remark under this kind of general head. Besides the two core programs, Bob also mentioned very quickly early on in the lecture as high points in the classical project of analysis the attempt to reduce arithmetic to logic, and the theory of descriptions. Frege had to acknowledge that his logicism about arithmetic failed. But Frege's project yielded achievements that stand firm in spite of that failure. Frege devised new ways, beyond those available to the logicians whose work he superseded, to use logical vocabulary in order to make explicit what certain claims commit one to, so that inferences to those consequential commitments could be codified in a form that required no leaps of intuition. That's quite analogous, from one point of view, to what the theory of descriptions aims to do. Now, in these two cases, it seems to me that it would be a stretch to talk of logical elaboration from a privileged vocabulary. There's indeed logical elaboration from a vocabulary usable to express significances that, for these purposes, needn't be conceived as internally structured, to a vocabulary usable to express significances that we can see as built out of those simple contents, built in such a way that we can codify inferences from forms of words using this complex vocabulary. But that doesn't amount to privileging the simple vocabulary. There is, if you like, privileging of the logical vocabulary, the vocabulary that combines with the simple vocabulary to make fully explicit the significance of the vocabulary that's analyzed in terms of the simple vocabulary. But this privileging of logical vocabulary amounts to no more than accepting that logical vocabulary is uniquely well suited for making logical structure explicit. How could that be open to dispute? This isn't a case of the kind of essentially contestable privileging of one vocabulary over others that figures in the core programs of empiricism and naturalism, and that I'm suggesting still figures in Bob's new version of the project of analysis. Now, I asked a few minutes back why we should suppose that privileging a vocabulary for saying what speakers do with words is any better than the kind of privileging that's characteristic of the empiricist program or the naturalist program. And I suggested that Rortian pragmatism recommends a general suspicion of all such claims of privilege. I should admit, as I indicated back then, that there's a quick and easy response to that suggestion. Rortian suspicions attach to singling out vocabularies on such grounds as that they capture how things really, really are, or that they capture foundations for our knowledge of how things really, really are. And that's not the kind of privilege that's supposed to attach, in Bob's analytic pragmatism, to vocabularies for specifying linguistic practices. Bob's favored vocabularies don't owe their claim on us, their claim to favor, to their being supposedly closer to the language in which the world describes itself, or to the language in which the world makes itself known to us, or anything like that. That's, I'm getting at the grounds for Rortian suspicion of privilege. Well, all right, that's fair enough, but that indicates at most that the privileging that Bob envisages needn't be suspect in quite the way I was suggesting. In this lecture, he wants to generate a positive presumption in favor of the privileging that he envisages, privileging language for saying what people do with words, on the ground that it reflects an insight of what he calls methodological pragmatism, and in particular, an insight that can be credited to the later Wittgenstein. He acknowledges, it's in the small print, for those of you who've actually looked at the text, so he didn't acknowledge it out loud this morning, but he does acknowledge in the small print that his way of reading Wittgenstein is risky, in that he's finding support in Wittgenstein for a kind of undertaking that Wittgenstein doesn't engage in himself or encourage in others. Now, I have to say that I think Bob's treatment of Wittgenstein's later philosophy largely misses its point. There isn't a cachet for the revised version of the project of analysis that he wants there to be. Sort of argument from authority here. Bob finds in Wittgenstein a general picture of linguistic practice according to which language is polymorphous, that is, it's a motley, and it's indefinitely open to new ways of using words. So far, I think so good. But Bob represents the anti-systematic slant of Wittgenstein's philosophy as a conclusion that Wittgenstein draws idiosyncratically from that general picture of language. I quote a bit. Those who are moved by the pragmatist picture, that's motley, extendable, dynamic, generally accept the particularist, quietist conclusions Wittgenstein seems to have drawn from it. That's how Bob purports to respect the fundamentals of Wittgenstein's approach to language, accepts the general picture, while refusing to make this supposed inferential step to the thought that we shouldn't be aiming at anything systematic. Bob must be inviting us to regard that thought, the thought we shouldn't be aiming at anything systematic, as an inessential excrescence in Wittgenstein's thinking. So he aims to represent his own systematic approach to language as accommodating, indeed as inspired by, the main insight of Wittgenstein's approach. Now, I think that gets things backwards. Wittgenstein's so-called quietism, terrible label, isn't a conclusion disputably inferred from a general pragmatist picture that encapsulates the substance of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. On the contrary, the so-called quietism is the whole point. I doubt that Wittgenstein would find much interest in the style of philosophy that's exemplified by the core programs of the classical analytic project. Wittgenstein's characteristic concern isn't a frame of mind in which the meanings expressed in some singled out region of language are taken to be unproblematic, while the meanings expressed in other regions are taken to be problematic, and so thought to need illumination in terms of the supposedly unmysterious base. Wittgenstein's characteristic concern is a frame of mind in which meaningfulness überhaupt, meaningfulness as such, is experienced as a mystery. Whether in the guise of a word being a word for something, of a signpost pointing in one direction rather than another, or a complicated case of a specification of a number series determining what it's correct to write down when one gets to a certain point in extending the series. Wittgenstein's target frame of mind can express itself in a superstitious conception. I think we can say specifically a fetishistic conception of the bearers of meaning, a conception in which minds, conceived as seats of remarkable powers, can somehow invest mere inanimate things with quasi-magical properties, so that an arrow's pointing, say, takes on the appearance of, now I quote, a hocus pocus, which can be performed only by the soul. That's Investigations 454. Wittgenstein's response, which I have to reduce to its bare essentials for the purposes of a quick sketch, is to suggest that when we fall into this kind of puzzlement about how a mere inanimate thing can have such powers, we're forgetting, so his response is a reminder, we're forgetting that the meaningful thing we're thinking about, a word, a signpost, the specification of a number series, is what it is by virtue of its involvement in a human practice. If we don't forget that context, we won't be tempted to think we're dealing with mere inanimate things, somehow infused with properties that really belong to souls. Ideally, that enables us to take in stride the idea of words for things, of signposts that point in various directions, of specifications of number series. That is, the felt mystery in principle evaporates Though, of course, that can't happen in as quick a time as it takes to describe it. Now, this kind of move, reminding ourselves of the human context in which, say, signposts, I'll focus on that case, are what they are, doesn't require us to describe what people do in the relevant practice without using the concept of a signpost, without using the concept of a thing that points in a certain direction. There's nothing in Wittgenstein to suggest that alleviating puzzlement about the concept of a thing that points the way requires us to describe a practice within which that concept has application, but without using that concept. The mystery about how a mere inanimate thing can indicate a direction evaporates, in principle evaporates, when we remind ourselves of the familiar human practice in which signposts are used. Signposts aren't mere inanimate things in the sense that figures in the puzzlement. On the contrary, they're signposts. And there's no reason not to use the idea of something that points in a certain direction when we state the content of this reminder. Nothing here recommends aiming to give a pragmatically mediated analysis of the concepts that figure in the style of philosophical puzzlement Wittgenstein is concerned with. Now, Bob notes that the interest of the analytic project that he describes is sensitive to the vocabulary in which we can specify a practice that's PV sufficient for some vocabulary that we're aiming to cast light on. But he doesn't dwell on the question whether we can expect to be able to do that in a way that permits something we can conceive as analysis of the target vocabulary. That question's surely crucial for the prospects of this new project of analysis. In specifying a practice that's PV sufficient for some vocabulary, we might just use, in second intention, expressions that belong to the vocabulary that we're giving a meta-vocabulary for. So we might say something like, in order to use the word person with the significance it has, you have to use it in such a way as to be able to be understood, to be saying things in which the concept of a person figures. If we frame a pragmatic beginning on a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. If we frame a pragmatic meta-vocabulary in terms like that, we're not producing something with a counterpart, now in a pragmatically inflected version, to the kind of interest that was supposed to be possessed by achievements in the classical project of analysis. That wouldn't be a contribution to anything that would deserve to be called a project of analysis. And I've been urging that Wittgenstein's response to philosophical anxiety about meaningfulness überhaupt contains nothing to encourage analytic aspirations for pragmatic meta-vocabularies. In some areas, no doubt, it may be possible to do better than that. You have to use the word person in such a way as to be able to be understood to be talking about persons. In some areas, it may be possible to do better than that by analytic standards. Though it's not really clear why we should think better by analytic standards implies better, period. Surely, whether a pragmatic analysis of a target vocabulary would be a good thing to have would depend on what, if any, legitimate puzzlements there are about the target vocabulary. And Bob doesn't here consider such questions. Note that Sellers's argument that there couldn't be a standalone practice of making observation reports doesn't depend on describing the practice otherwise than as the practice of making observation reports. Sellers's argument doesn't need to exploit something that could be turned into a pragmatist analysis of the contents, or maybe the kinds of content that are expressible in the practice, or practice fragment, as Sellers argues that it essentially is. Now, towards the end of the lecture, Bob mentioned one putative example of pragmatist analysis that I think is open to question, and I'm going to finish by talking about this. This was an example that was supposed to exemplify strict expressive bootstrapping within the new version of the project of analysis. So I'll give you the example again. It used to be common to explain indexical vocabulary in terms of non-indexical vocabulary, on a pattern exemplified by saying that a tokening of I refers to the speaker of the utterance that includes itself. More recent work has made it obvious that nothing like synonymy is provided by connections of forms of words on those lines. So obvious, indeed, that as Bob says, the question arises what those old guys can have been thinking. And Bob suggests that what they were doing was ineptly registering a pragmatically mediated semantic relation between indexical and non-indexical vocabularies. Their real point, Bob suggests, was that we can say entirely in non-indexical terms what one must do to be deploying indexical vocabulary correctly. Bob offered a formula that did that for all the indexicals at once, and I'm going to take out one bit of the formula just for simplicity, focusing on the case of the first person. What Bob's proposal amounts to for that case is this. There's a practical rule on these lines. If a speaker S wants to assert that some property P holds of S, no indexicals in there, then it's correct for S to say P holds of me. I'll say it again. If a speaker S wants to assert that some property holds of S, then it's correct for S to say P holds of me. But that actually seems wrong to me. Bob can explain what I'm missing if I'm missing something. It's correct in the only sense that seems relevant for S to say P holds of me, only if what S wants to assert is that P holds of himself. And there, himself is the kind of reflexive that, as Anscombe argues, can be understood only as an oratio obliqua counterpart of the first person. Indirect reflexive, there's a special form of it in classical Greek. Castaneda puts asterisks. If that's right, an accurate formulation of the correctness condition is, after all, not intelligible independently of understanding the first-person form. That is, it's not intelligible independently of understanding the relevant region of indexical vocabulary. Suppose S wants to say that P holds of S without wanting to say that the property P holds of himself. Oedipus wants to say that the property of being someone who ought to be banished holds of the slayer of Laius, not realizing that that's himself. It wouldn't occur to S in those circumstances to say P holds of me. If we allow ourselves to envisage him saying that, we can say this. For him to say that would be for him to say something that's true if the property does hold of what he wants to say the property holds of. But it wouldn't be for him to say what he wants to say. That's just the point on which the classical analysis goes wrong. And as far as I can see, it undermines Bob's attempt at a pragmatist descendant, pragmatist account of what they were getting right also. This points in the direction of an obvious answer to Bob's question, what can Russell, Carnap, and Reichenbach have been thinking? Their non-indexical formulations give conditions under which the indexical utterances that they're concerned with are true. Their mistake was to think that relation amounts to something on the lines of a synonymy relation. And it's not clear to me, anyway, that pragmatic mediation pulls any weight in making this any easier to understand. Thank you.
So we have 45 minutes, but the first answer is given to Bob. He can answer.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, John. I guess I see you having raised three questions, an overarching methodological one, an issue specifically about Wittgenstein, and then closing on the indexicals. And so let me address things in that order. The methodological question, I think, is indeed not inseparable from how we think about the prospects for analytic philosophy. When I was first writing these lectures, the first human being who read the early version of them was my Dr. Vater Richard Rorty, and his characteristic response was thematic for John's remarks. He says, well, why would anyone set out intentionally to prolong the death agonies of analytic philosophy by another decade? Which was what he thought I was trying to do here. And that seems to be more or less the attitude John is taking. Well, I want to say two things. Look, I think there is something to this tradition. I think there's something we, in an extended sense of we, have been on about during this that is worth recovering from the wreckage of some of the paradigmatic core programs of it. As John says, I'm not an empiricist, I'm not a naturalist. I claim a third core function is AI functionalism. I'm not an artificial intelligence functionalist either. I don't think any of those core programs is actually going to work. He's asking reasonably, well then, why do you think there's something worthwhile here? Well, one thing to say about this is there's two things that I'm trying to point to a new future for, or breathe new life into. One of them is analytic philosophy. The other is pragmatism. This is supposed to be an analytic pragmatism. I don't see this as a one-way street. I think John thinks pragmatism is alive and triumphant, and so its organs are going to be transplanted into the corpse or near corpse of analytic philosophy. I actually think pragmatism has been looking somewhat peaked these days too, and that it's precisely the quietistic aspect of it. Don't think, look, micro descriptions of practices and so on, but actually we haven't even been doing all that much micro descriptions of practices in the pragmatist tradition. It's not so clear what we should be doing. Tending our roses and not worrying about it, maybe. And again, it seems to me that there are really fundamental and important insights in the pragmatist tradition and actual important work of understanding to be done from that perspective, and that precisely what's needed to help us do that is to bring it together with some of the insights from analytic philosophy. Well, I mean, what's wrong with these core programs? I do think, as John suggested, it's a certain way of thinking about the privileging of one vocabulary over another. I mean, I didn't say anything, for reasons that maybe become clear, about what reasons you might have for privileging one vocabulary as a base vocabulary over another as an empiricist, as a naturalist, as a functionalist about the mind. Mostly, I'm completely uninterested in that question, because it seems to me that the interest in understanding the relations between vocabularies and the extent to which it is possible to say in one vocabulary most, if not all, of what can be said in another vocabulary, perhaps by the use of logic, should not at all be held hostage to the question of why you're interested in those vocabularies, or any collateral views that you may have about how one of them is more important or privileged in some way rather than another. It seems to me there's a kind of intelligibility, a kind of understanding that comes from investigating these relations between vocabularies that one precisely should not take the second step that I think of as characteristic of traditional metaphysics. Look, I think of traditional metaphysics as having said, here is a vocabulary that for some reason I'm confident about. Here's my base vocabulary. And now notice when I look at these other vocabularies, metaphysics in general, the attempt to find a vocabulary in which everything can be said. So all these other vocabularies, we're going to be able to say what's in this. And then we look and, well, you can never say everything else in it, even by whatever controversial standards you've got. There's always some things, you've got a good story, yes, I can say these things in the target vocabulary, in my base vocabulary, at least so I claim. But then there are always these awkward things that you can't say. My view at that point is, well, look, we've learned something when we see that. When we see that the expressive resources of this vocabulary suffice to express this much of what you could say in this other vocabulary, but not these other things. But the impulse characteristic of traditional metaphysics was to say, so those things aren't real. What's real is what you can say with the expressive resources that I, for some reason or other, have argued are particularly perspicuous or whatever. The rest of these, they're not real. Or for those of you who participated in the discussion with Michael Kramer about Dummett's views about logic yesterday, I think that the beginning of wisdom in thinking about logic is not to look for the right logic, but to observe the different expressive powers of classical logical connectives, intuitionistic relevance ones, and so on. Dummett notices some differences in the expressive power of intuitionism and classical logic and says, so classical logic is unintelligible. It manages to confer no actual content on its things. Only what meets these particular conditions, has this particular expressive power. That's the old bad metaphysical impulse. My picture is that understanding is knowing our way around in ultimately an inferentialist, expressivist network of different vocabularies, practice fragments, and so on, and seeing what the relations between them are. So that we'll pick something, because it's Tuesday, we pick this as a base vocabulary, and see what that's expressed in other target vocabularies we can find a way to express in this base vocabulary. And then on Thursday, we pick another one and come over here. And eventually, we're going to know our way around better in the relations between these different kinds of vocabularies, which cut across each other in various ways. Here we're looking at definite descriptions. Here we're looking at modal vocabulary, and we're looking at all of these. So I don't think that what ought to be understood as essential and taken forward in a progressive way in analytic philosophy was the extent to which it was a metaphysical program. I mean, this would have horrified the founders of this tradition to have it described that way, but I think that having this invidious notion of privileging, the discriminatory notion of privileging, that is the old metaphysical impulse, and that's always what was unpleasant and thuggish about the analytic tradition. But it's never been what was important. Vocabulary that resolutely restricts itself to talking about pieces of wood and movements of people in the vicinity. Now, the view that would say, well, if you can't say everything about it in the language of pieces of wood and movements of primates in the vicinity, then it's unintelligible, or there's something defective about it. That's to make that second inappropriate move. But I do think that it's still worth thinking about various naturalistic vocabularies and what expressive relations they stand into various other kinds of vocabularies. And that's the spirit in which I'm going to be talking about normative vocabulary, about modal vocabulary, about intentional vocabulary in the lectures to come. So I think there's a way to draw a line that puts what's objectionable about the analytic tradition, its metaphysical impulses to one side, while still to keep what was right and genuinely contributing to our understanding of things front and center, and go forward with that. As to the discussion of Wittgenstein, well, my beloved colleague John is one of those who I think draws the quietist, particularist, semantic nihilist conclusions from Wittgenstein. All right, he says that's not a conclusion from a general view of language, because Wittgenstein wouldn't have a general view of anything. The point is the particularism, the nihilism, and so on. Well, maybe it is. I certainly agree that Wittgenstein does want us to think about the signpost in an environment where there are persons and uses of it. I myself found your account of the, or gesture at an account of the signpost using practice a little bit thin. I mean, we have to think about it in an environment where there are signposts. Well, yes, I think maybe in the end that's right, but I also think that there's a lot more articulate things that can be said about it. And I think that one methodologically promising, not merely tempting, but actually promising way to fill in and articulate that picture is to try and think about the possibility of pragmatically bootstrapping accounts of that practice of using signposts that don't use the concept of a signpost or knowing which way to go. Now, it's not going to be the language of wood and movements, but if we, can we help ourselves to a normative language, but not yet a language of signposts and semantic content? How much of that practice, if we describe what you're doing, allowing ourselves to use a deontic vocabulary that talks about correctnesses of various doings, but restricts itself from using semantic and intentional vocabulary. Now, how much of a practice of using signposts can we express? How much of what we say in the signpost language can we say in a normative but not yet intentional and semantic vocabulary? I want to ask that question quite generally about discursive practices. Now, it may well turn out that we can say some things, but not everything, and I want to systematically resist the conclusion from that, okay, then there's something spooky or fishy about the stuff we can't say in that way, but I think we'll understand something if we do that. How much could we say using a language of a lethic modality, but not the normative, and so on. I took you to be claiming that we weren't going to get a bootstrapping account. Going pragmatic isn't going to help us get a bootstrapping account of the phenomena that Wittgenstein most cares about. Maybe so. Well, let's try it and find out. I didn't hear, and surely you didn't intend, a transcendental deduction of the impossibility of bootstrapping accounts of anything. And since I believe I have some bootstrapping accounts of some things in my back pocket, I propose to lay them out and see, what we can do along those lines. So I may be missing the Wittgensteinian point, but I still think there's that kind of stuff to find out, even if you're entirely right about the conclusion we're going to end up in. Now, the indexical point, there's a longer discussion of this that I'm only epitomizing and gesturing at here. It's a very delicate issue. I do believe that one can say in an entirely non-indexical language can formulate rules in an entirely non-indexical language for the correct use of indexicals. That claim I am committed to, and John clearly denies that. I do not think that non-indexical language is an autonomous discursive practice, an autonomous vocabulary. I don't believe it's intelligible that there should be creatures who speak only a non-indexical language. And this is for reasons that will be familiar to readers of Gareth Evans, for instance. I think his account of the way in which one needs to be able to map egocentric space and public space onto one another in order so much as to have the concept of spatiotemporal continuance, I think this is right. So when John says that what you have to be able to do to use non-indexical language is, I think this is a quote, not intelligible entirely independently of the capacity to use indexicals, I actually agree with that. I don't think you can use non-indexical vocabulary unless you can also use indexical vocabulary. But that's a separate claim from the question of whether someone who can use both kinds of vocabulary can formulate rules in the non-indexical language that specify sufficient conditions for correctly using the indexical vocabulary. So it's a delicate issue, and certainly if one were inclined if one were engaged dialectically with the sort of made-up skeptic that I mentioned briefly, the one who says, well, I don't even understand indexical vocabulary, the place to start would be with the argument that non-indexical vocabulary is not autonomous. So you can't actually be in the position he claims, that the skeptic claims to be in there. But of course, that's not the point that I'm after. So I think the question about the independence of these two kinds of vocabulary is one thing, and I accept, I'm not claiming that non-indexical vocabulary is autonomous. Nonetheless, someone who, partly in virtue of being able to use indexicals, in fact, actually is the master of non-indexical vocabulary, only needs to use the capacities he's using to deploy the non-indexical vocabulary to state rules that determine the correct use of the indexical vocabulary. That's the claim, anyway.
Thank you very much. So if there are questions from the floor, Sebastian Rödel.
John McDowell was urging that the attraction of the form of comprehension that you represent the analytic project as delivering, namely illuminating one vocabulary by its relation to another, depends on conceiving of the one vocabulary as more fundamental epistemologically or metaphysically, and you retreated, I understand you, from this, or you denied this claim that this is the ground of the attraction of this form of comprehension. It's attractive just to find such relations, and even though the relation is asymmetric, we can, as it were, regain symmetry by first using this as basic and then next day the other, and so this evens out somehow. But still, when it's not clear to me why this form of comprehension at all should seem particularly attractive, or why it should exhaust the possibilities of philosophical comprehension. So I just want to ask, is there such a thing as comprehending philosophically one vocabulary, not in terms of another, but in terms of itself? Is there such a thing as an investigation, philosophical investigation, into one vocabulary which does not relate it to something other, to different vocabulary? Or would that be out of bounds for analytic philosophy? Just to give an example of what I'm thinking of, when I'm thinking of the two critiques of Kant, of pure reason and of practical reason, we might describe their topic as a certain vocabulary. But in case of practical reason, perhaps moral vocabulary, and pure reason, perhaps the vocabulary of the understanding of nature. But he doesn't seem to gain comprehension by turning to a different vocabulary. So is there this form of comprehension, or is the only alternative to explaining one vocabulary in terms of another quietism? Are these the only alternatives for you, or is there a third possibility which is neither of the form that you call analysis nor quietism?
Okay, well, thank you, Sebastian. That's a very interesting and penetrating question. I certainly am not claiming that the only form of comprehension or the only form of philosophical comprehension is the form that was pursued by classical analytic philosophy, even in the expanded version that I have. There certainly can be, within a single vocabulary, the articulation and bringing to consciousness to semantic consciousness now of, for instance, the inferential articulation that is what makes its expressions mean what they mean, where one doesn't stand outside that practice in order to understand it. Discourse as such must be like that. There isn't anywhere to go for another vocabulary to understand talking. We've got to do that from within. And so, discursive practice, the thing I think we philosophers are most concerned with as a whole, must be like that. But I think within that discursive practice, there is a distinctive form of understanding that is illuminating one region of it in the light of another, or by its relation to another, and that's precisely articulating the internal structure of discursive practice, bringing out into the light of explicit day implicit relations between these different regions, between the different sub-vocabularies of autonomous discursive practices generally. So I do think that there's an alternative to the quietism that really just stands back and lets it all be. I don't suppose we have any actual practitioners of that. Certainly John is not a practitioner of that. He's a wild-eyed constructive philosopher, even if that thought makes him very nervous. So I mean, I do think that there are many paths to understanding how discourse works and what difference it makes to us people who talk. This is the one that I think analytic philosophy, focusing particularly on logic, as I've described it elsewhere, the organ of semantic self-consciousness, and that's what I'll be talking about beginning this afternoon. I think it represented a progressive transformation of traditional metaphysics, even as practiced in the early modern period, even though it unconsciously took over bad aspects of it that it meant to get beyond as well, and that maybe we're in a position finally to leave behind us.
Paul Hornet.
This is a question for Bob. You've often expressed, although not today, your agreement with Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction. So in other words, you agree, I think, that there's no such thing as the meaning or the significance of a term. But in that case, I wonder how one can be in a position to judge that a given practice is PV sufficient for some vocabulary to have the significance that it has. How can one tell that one has, as it were, characterized enough of the use of the vocabulary to capture the meaning, if there's no such thing as the meaning? Now, it would seem that the only answer to this question, the only way to be in a position to make that judgment, that you have something which really is PV sufficient, is to have a characterization of what we might call the entire practice with the vocabulary. But as we know, the entire practice of the vocabulary, since there will be sentences involving the vocabulary and any other piece of vocabulary you might want, means that you will need, in order to have something which is PV sufficient, to describe, the entire language, and which will, I think, undermine the idea of any kind of bootstrapping, because the meanings of every other terms in the language are going to have to be sort of brought into the characterization of the practice, which is sufficient for any piece of vocabulary.
Okay, good. I think there's two separate issues that you've raised. I don't have a general answer to the question, how do you tell whether something is PV sufficient or not? In the particular cases, in the examples that we'll deal with, you'll see I have different forms of argument sort of for each one, because these vocabularies cut across each other in various ways. In general, I think you have to have some semantic account of what those meanings are that you're trying to capture, of the sort that John and I were each invoking when we were talking about indexical vocabulary. Have you really gotten an indexical in play? And here we know, well, what we're looking for is something that will exhibit the essential indexicality features that really will be intersubstitutable with indexicals in specifically modal and epistemic contexts, because that's where we found the core of indexicality to be. But that's because we have a semantic account of the kind of meaning we're trying to get at. And so now we can ask, well, would a creature who was acting in a way describable in the following way, would their term be intersubstitutable with an indexical in one of these contexts? Now, the answer for normative vocabulary is obviously going to depend on what you think essential features of normative vocabulary are. I would say being usable to make explicit your commitment to various patterns of practical inference and so on. So I don't have a general answer to the question of how you tell what are the criteria of adequacy for PV sufficiency. That, I think, has to be argued on a case-by-case basis, looking at the kind of vocabulary you're talking about. And it is always going to be sensitive to how good a job you've done in specifying the semantic criteria of adequacy that are your output measure. The other point you made is all the vocabularies that we can actually talk about are going to be language fragments. That they're only going to be vocabulary that's used in the context of lots of other vocabulary. So how can we abstract out and say, well, we've got a set of practices here that are sufficient for using these, when using these bits of vocabulary, using these locutions, depends on your being able to use all the others. And here it seems to me that we can do a sort of separation of variables thing. we're going to have to be assuming all along that these are language users, discursive creatures that we've got, and so they can use some autonomous, they can engage in some autonomous discursive practice, they can use some autonomous vocabulary, that this is just a fragment of. But we can look at different fragments of it and help ourselves to the background abilities to use, well, everything that isn't in the fragment we've got here. Though the fragment isn't autonomous, often it will be the case that the autonomous practice minus the fragment is something that we can actually intelligibly describe somebody as using. I think, for instance, that I can intelligibly describe creatures who use only non-logical expressions, who don't have conditionals and negation in their language. And so then we can assume that we've got creatures that have all the abilities required to use the non-logical vocabulary, and if we've described, what we need to argue for is that the additional abilities that we're throwing in would be enough to transform their practical capacity to use that non-logical stuff into the capacity to use the logical vocabulary, for instance. So though this is clearly a problem, I think it's one that can be addressed, at least in the particular cases of the kind of vocabulary that I think I have some results for.
Friedrich Kambarl.
When listening to both of you, Bob? Yes. When listening to both of you, to Bob and John McDowell, I got the idea that there could be a sort of mediation, which perhaps you don't have in mind, and that's the only reason for my remark now. I mean, I'm not an interpreter of Wittgenstein, which thinks that he is a quietist of some kind. But if something would survive a quietistic interpretation of Wittgenstein, I would say it is that a vocabulary or language expressions come with a practice together, jointly. Now, if this is okay, if we buy this from Wittgenstein as a fundamental insight, which I would do, then I think we could say that if we have a vocabulary, let's say classical semantic analysis vocabulary, which has, so to speak, got off the ground, the practical ground, which can't make clear its embeddedness in a certain practice which comes with it, that then this vocabulary is a problematic vocabulary. In a sense, I think John McDowell used the word problematic vocabularies. So at least there are problematic vocabularies, even in a Wittgensteinian perspective. And then the question is, if handling this analytically, in some sense, handling these problematic vocabularies would mean to give them back some embedding, some embeddedness in a certain practice. So that, in my listening to you, must be bought by both of you, as far as I can see. And then the problem is, how do we do that? How do we restitute to those problematic vocabularies their, by Wittgenstein, assumed ground, practical grounds? How do we do this? That would be one thing. And the other thing would be, if we don't succeed in doing this, is this a very severe reason to say, and I think Wittgenstein had something in mind of that kind, do away with this vocabulary. So that's what I want.
I think I agree with everything you said. I'm just not sure that it amounts to what you offered it as, a mediation between what Bob wants to do with Wittgenstein and what I think is actually there in Wittgenstein. Surely it's right that the very idea of a vocabulary with a significance is inextricably bound up with the idea of a way of using that vocabulary. And that yields a possibility of conclusive, if you can make it out, ways of representing candidate vocabularies as problematic. I mean, if you can say of some supposed meaningful, some supposed attachment of a meaning to a word, look, there's only a fantasy in the area where there would need to be a real viable practice of using a word in such a way that it had that meaning. Well, then there's something badly wrong with the thought that... but that's not what Bob is doing. That's as I hear it, beginning on sketching a program for a general description of a mode of philosophical activity. There's a very general divergence here between Bob and me. A mode of philosophical activity that's driven by problems, or maybe one should say by supposed problems. Philosophers don't, for no reason out of the blue, fall into fantasies of the attachability of meanings to words. They do so in response to what they perceive as problems. The large difference between Bob and me, as I see it, is that he wants to not just describe but engage in a mode of philosophy that isn't problem-driven. The spirit in which one engages in it is something like, let's do this, maybe something interesting will come out. With luck, something interesting will come out. But the interest of the envisaged result doesn't hinge on there having been antecedently some intellectual difficulty that the result will answer to. So right, the interest is self-generated by the project itself. Whereas my paradigm, philosophical activity is problem-driven, and then I say supposed problem-driven. It's fine for Bob to do what he does, but I don't think he ought to represent doing what he does as going on doing what problem-driven philosophy was already doing. There's a cleaner break from the classical analytic tradition and the pragmatist challenge to it, if that's going to be personified by Wittgenstein in the kind of activity that Bob is recommending, especially in his responses after the lecture, than I think he confesses to.
Well, I think John is right that one of the big differences between us is that he thinks that philosophical activity is, and by rights ought to be, driven by felt philosophical problems. I mean, maybe in the interests of full disclosure, he should mention that he thinks those problems are always misconceived, and that the result will always be a diagnosis according to which you should not, in the end, have been puzzled and will be brought back to something like where you were before, only now being comfortable being there. Certainly my picture is much more abstract curiosity about how things work that I don't think needs to be driven by thinking that we're going to be in deep trouble if we can't understand how this thing works in these other terms. Understanding is a matter of knowing your way about, and I'm going to poke over here and see how it looks from here, and it doesn't seem to me that that needs to be driven by the sort of urgency John is talking about. Now, I also accept Fritz's characterization and his proposed middle ground, which does seem to me more genuine middle ground than maybe it does to John. And in this connection, it may be worth saying that I think of John and myself as having engaged in exactly the enterprise that Fritz was describing in our previous work. We both greatly admire Dick Rorty, who in the philosophy and the Mirror of Nature argued that two central concepts in the philosophical tradition, not just the analytic tradition, but the whole modern tradition, that precisely have separated themselves from any rough Wittgensteinian ground, from any connection to a practice that could give them the kind of meaning they're assumed to have, are the concepts of experience and of representation. And Rorty's suggestion was that the way forward for philosophy was to get rid of those notions as no longer having the kind of meaning that could support real philosophical work with them. I think of John in Mind and World as having shown how one could rehabilitate a notion of experience, a perceptual experience, without falling into the myth of the given, without remaining disconnected from actual practice in the way that Rorty thought was inevitable for it. And I, in the second half of making it explicit, seek to do the same thing for the concept of representation. Indeed, I believe Hugh Price is going to complain about that later on in our discussion. That is, I think John and I have been engaged already in the enterprise of trying to find at least versions of concepts that have been taken by philosophers so far out of a grounding in human practice as to make them potentially meaningless, as Rorty claimed, but to say, no, actually you can rehabilitate these things. I should say, I'm still really pessimistic about doing that for experience. It is not one of my words, but John has a sanitized way of using it. Fritz's final question is, what do we do if we keep trying to rehabilitate one of these concepts and we can't do it? Does there come a point at which we should just give up on it? And there I want to say, well, it depends on what you mean by we. At a certain point, it's going to look as though it's not rewarding our efforts to do this anymore. And as I'm inclined to do with the concept of experience, as Rorty is inclined to do with the concept also of representation, you say, look, I'm not going to use this anymore. This is not one of my words. But you never know when someone will come along, as John did, and to all of our astonishment say that the one thing that we should have thought we knew made no sense in philosophy, say Russell's doctrine of knowledge by acquaintance, actually there's a way of making perfectly good sense of that so that we can understand it. Rehabilitating those empty philosophical concepts, that's one of the motors of progress. And somebody's going to be curious enough or perverse enough to try and do that, and often they succeed, and often that's the way forward.
Just quickly, I wouldn't dream of saying that philosophy is and ought only to be the deconstruction of supposed problems. The point was rather something like that you, Bob, ought to fess up to how novel the thing that you're doing is. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not philosophy because it's not the deconstruction of antecedent problems. But it isn't the deconstruction of antecedent problems, whereas you have this, right, always wish to represent yourself as going on doing what the dead guys, and in this case it's specifically dead guys who were into addressing problems, were doing. So you ought to be more in the business of blowing trumpets for the novelty of this conception of a philosophical activity where the interest is all in the hoped for result, not in the way in which the hoped for result is going to clear up an antecedent obscurity.
Going to approach the end of this session, but there is still one contribution.
Me too. I wanted to express my worries about your dealing with indexicals, because as you know, as Frege had the notion that we need some context to add. And he thought that these are the deviants, but the main power in indexical is, like Charles Sanders Peirce said, is the direct relation. It is in cause, time, person, and in place. So in the case that you have something that, in the case that you, with regard to the indexicals I, we had the problems from Descartes, Liechtenstein, and so forth. And Bertrand Russell had shifted between his position, is this the I or that and this. But in the case, you see, in the case that you use the strength of these indexicals, this means the relations to reality, to the outer semantic reality, you have a capacity that cannot be reduced. And so I have something like an I, like a mental relation with regard to the indexical I, what we called the thought. So in the case that you replace this by sentences or statements about, I is the speaker of this utterance. And for this I, you introduce a name, for example. You lose the capacities of these indexicals. So they are not just context sensitive, but also have an account that is sometimes surely called a metaphysical one and a mental one, and not just a pragmatic one. And Quine replaces it by variables, but different to variables. And indexicals fixes something in place and time and personally. You won't get these capacities by other elements of languages. And for this sense, in the case that you deal indexicals, just like your vocabulary, like who, how, or what you said, I think you get lost. One of the most important feature of natural languages. This was my point.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Indexicals are not semantically reducible to or interchangeable with any non-indexical expressions. That's part of what we learned, as I was saying, from Perry, from Lewis, from Anscombe. It's something that people had already thought about in terms of the kind of metaphysical point that you make. Absolutely, you cannot do what you can do with indexicals without indexicals. You cannot say what you can say indexically without indexicals for just the sorts of reasons that you indicated. And the construction I was suggesting is not supposed to be some trick for denying that or getting around that. It's rather pointing out that there's a different relation between non-indexical and indexical expressions that is not reducibility or interchangeability, but rather that you can give instructions for using those indexicals in their irreducible way. You can give those instructions in non-indexical terms, and following those instructions will be sufficient for you to be using indexical expressions that have all of those irreducible features. It still won't let you say in non-indexical terms what you can say in indexical terms, but it will tell you what you have to do to be using those very special terms in that irreducible way. Now, that may not be interesting to somebody who, say, wanted to contest the irreducibility claim. They're going to say, well, no, I'm still worried about this irreducibility. That I'm not addressing. If there are people who are worried about whether it's true that it's irreducible or whether the fact that I can say something, I can have an irreducibly indexical thought that you in principle cannot share because you can't have the same I thought that I have. People have worried about whether that makes these things incommunicable or unintelligible. This is something John's written about, or whether the mere fact that we can have corresponding thoughts is enough. There are people who worry that it seems that God can't have indexical thoughts, and that maybe there's a problem that means that we can think things God can't think. Those are all worries that people might have about indexicals that are not at all addressed by what I was saying. I was making, in a way, a very modest point, which doesn't mean it might not be false, of course. But
So thank you, Bob. Thank you, John. And thank you all. We meet again at 3 o'clock here for the afternoon session.